It is it's so profoundly weird, I would say, especially for those of us my age who experienced the Cuban Missile Crisis and the first Cold War, not the one that we're in right now, which we now see is really a continuation. It never ended in 1992, contrary to legend. I make the mistake every once in a while of actually reading the comment lines under Financial Times articles. And the Financial Times is, Gideon Rockman, for example, writes something where he maybe has a sentence or two about the nuclear threat. And then all of the comments are, what threat? Don't let them blackmail us. Basically, what's a little nuclear war among friends? So you read this in the comment section and my God, you realize also how sad it must be to be a writer or reporter when that's your readership. Oh, come on, are you kidding? Because every comment is, don't worry about it. Don't be blackmailed about it. It's not real. I bet he won't do it. Let's find out. So what? And then if somebody writes, oh my God, we should take nuclear war seriously. Russian troll, Putin apologist. The moment you say something. So it is bizarre. And we had that experience, by the way, as a little controlled trial in the U.S. Biden says nothing about this, basically. But at I think it was 2022 in the fall, he said in a fundraiser to donors, which is really the only time he speaks to the, quote, American people, when he's speaking to some rich people in a private donor fundraiser, he said, we may be on the road to Armageddon. And he used the word Armageddon. What was the reaction in the press? It was literally the Wall Street Journal the next day or the day after in the editorial page chastising the president for scaring the American people. And how dare he use a word like that? And what's gotten into him? So the norm is don't discuss this. Don't consider this. And the idea is probably they won't do it. Oh, it's only 10% chance the world ends. It's the most insane feature of our time right now. And again, the pain of all of this is if one knows just a little bit of history, how false readings on radar of a bird flock that passed the radar looked like incoming ICBMs, and or a training tape that was left on that led a nighttime supervisor in an early warning system think that there was an incoming attack. Or the most famous, or should be famous, actually it's almost unknown, I should say, but the most remarkable incident in modern human history. It's a good quiz question to ask people. Which one individual above all most clearly saved the world? And the man's name is Arkhipov, and he's known by 1 in a million or maybe less in the world. And he was the Soviet political officer on a disabled Soviet submarine where the skipper of the submarine had ordered the firing of a nuclear-tipped torpedo after Kennedy and Khrushchev had arrived at their compromise agreement, but the word had not reached the disabled submarine. And under U.S. military doctrine, being fired upon by any nuclear weapon, a nuclear-tipped torpedo, a tactical battlefield nuclear weapon, or a strategic nuclear weapon, was to trigger the full nuclear arsenal of the United States against Russia, Soviet Union, China, and all of Central and Eastern Europe under the Soviet regime. and the estimates of those days was 700 million deaths out of 3 billion. Of course, not taking into account the global famine that would have followed and all the rest. And we came within a second of that. And it's not even known by most. And Daniel Ellsberg of the Pentagon Papers and Martin Sherwin, the great historian who died a couple of years ago and is the author of co-author of Oppenheimer, which became the movie, wrote about this in a book that everybody should read called Gambling with Armageddon. And the point of the book, which focuses on the Cuban Missile Crisis, but more generally discusses the fact that we're in the gamble with survival of the human species to an incredible extent. And he talks about this Arkhipov episode. People don't know these things. They're not thinking. They're not discussing them. They're not learning about them. And so somehow the fact that the U.S. might be embarrassed in Ukraine by not having its absolutely stupid idea of expanding NATO to Ukraine succeed is worth gambling with Armageddon. That's the situation we're in. And yes, every European leader stands up and salutes the United States in this, lies about everything, and says, sure, why risk it? And again, these leaders of the Baltic states, what the hell are they doing? They have countries of 1 or 2 or 3 million people on the border of Russia. They are not nuclear powers, but they're saying Russia must be destroyed. Are they out of their minds? Do they think the U.S. is really going to keep them safe? Do they think a nuclear war is going to just be dandy for Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania? What is on their minds? But your point is right. It's completely not understandable to me, but it is the reality that we do not have any self-control right now. And we have no capacity to understand our own behavior, maybe because it is this agenda of secretive intelligence armies for the last not even 30 years, but for the last 60 years. And it's on a kind of fixed rudder, and our politicians are useless in this. This is really where we stand. By the way, it's fascinating, and it's so hard to uncover all of this, but there's a lot of known history and some not so known history about how the CIA immediately starting in 1945, following OSS work, started running the neo-Nazi units of Western Ukraine. The same groups, the Banderistas and others that are real. This isn't just a Russian figment of the imagination. These are literal groups with literal people who were literally on the CIA and MI6 account and were run for decades because they would help to undermine Russia or undermine the Soviet Union. So these games, which are the fun games of the James Bond movies and were mocked in Mad Magazine as the white spy and the black spy, playing games with this is what's bringing us to 90 seconds to midnight right now.
I completely agree. Just again, a few points here. I mean, about the fact that there's been this disappearance of fear of nuclear war and this constant talking about the Russians bluffing. Bluffing is a word that comes from gambling. It just confirms that we are gambling on what the other side is doing, that we assume that they're bluffing, even whilst we insist that then we are not. It's an astonishing thing. And if it's the risk that they're not bluffing and that we could find ourselves in a nuclear war is 0.1%. That is too big a risk, far too big a risk. Any risk at all in this kind of situation is far too great, especially given that all of these problems which have existed and which have accumulated and which are getting worse are still problems that can be resolved properly through negotiations in a way that is not going to compromise or endanger anyone. And if we're talking about specifically the Baltic states, which are small countries next to this giant colossus, which is Russia, the best guarantor of their independence and security is Russia itself, not the superpower far away, a continent and an ocean away, which can only ultimately protect them by risking its own existence. Again, I would have thought that was obvious, and I would have thought, again, that a US president or a US administration ought to be pointing that fact out to them. And so should the other European countries, which are being led by the Baltic states into policies which I find astonishing. The influence, the sway that these Baltic states have achieved over European policy absolutely astonishes me. Now, these are not.
I can tell you,
yeah.
just to tell you a story about that. This Kaja Kallas, the leader of Estonia, I knew her dad actually rather well, Sim Kallas, who was in 1991 president of the Central Bank of Estonia. Estonia gained its independence in 1991. I had a very wonderful Estonian Canadian student who said, "Jeff, come to Tallinn. They need help." So I came to Tallinn back in 1991, in March 1991. Interestingly, the hotel was freezing. We had to wear a winter coat because there was no heat. There was no fuel. And I had a meeting with Sim Kallas one evening in a bar, and he described to me, "What do we do? We're in the ruble zone. We need to have we're a new nation. We need to have an independent currency." So I knew something about that. That was my my profession. So I designed basically on a napkin that evening how Estonia could make a national currency. They adopted it literally the next day, that idea, and a month later, the Estonian kroon appeared. Now, what's interesting for me is I was there. The Russians didn't try to stop it. The Soviet Union wasn't even over yet at that time. And there was no attempt by Russia to invade Estonia. There was no desire to, quite the contrary. I was working with Gorbachev's team. I was working with Yeltsin after September 1991. I was working with the Estonians on helping them to design a post-ruble currency, which went into effect. The Russians wanted peace. They wanted quiet. They wanted rebuilding. They wanted integration with Europe. It was so normal. This is exactly the moment that Cheney is saying, okay, now we dismember Russia. This is the crazed mindset of this hubristic, indispensable nation, the United States. It just could not say yes. And now I see the daughter. Yeah, I got, by the way, one of the highest awards of the Estonian state for my work in helping them set up the currency, because it remained stable for the next 20 years, and then they adopted the euro. It was a good success, good economic success, especially for an evening discussion about how to set up a currency. And now I see this hatred from the Estonians, hatred, but provocation and warmongering, as if this is going to keep them safe. Are you kidding? It's completely the opposite. By the way, I was advisor to Poland in those years. I was their main outside advisor. And now I see Poland talking the same way. Radek Sikorski, the most aggressive foreign minister in Central and Eastern Europe, not to be compared with Baerbock, who is, Minister of War of Germany, in effect. But basically, where does the hate talk come from when it is not Russia that made these aggressions over the last 30 years? Just the opposite, when the United States could not say yes. But this is where the propaganda or the mental image or just the being suborned by U.S. Money and power and the military-industrial complex has come in. Almost nobody tells the truth. It's the best we have. Okay. I'm a big believer that because we're interconnected so profoundly across the world in our fate, whether it is environment, climate, nuclear war, pandemic, you name it, national borders are not so meaningful as sometimes we think. But we got organized in a world of nation states, one that was largely built by European imperial powers in the 19th and 20th century. I believe we need global government, not as a sole government, obviously, but as a way to solve global problems. Mm-hmm. And this is an idea that is essentially 1 century old. We never had global institutions until the middle of the 19th century, starting with the telegraph and postal union, and the beginnings of global pandemic preparedness, we'd say now, but it was for infectious disease. That was the beginning in the 1850s under European imperial domination and control. But even then, that wasn't really a global government in any way. Then after World War I, the idea was to create a League of Nations, and that got started by the British and the U.S. In 1920-21, but the U.S. decided not to join. So it was kind of stillborn, and it didn't prevent World War II, obviously. Then in the middle of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt, who's my favorite all-time president, said we need to try again with another organization. This time it ended not in Geneva, but on the East River, the United Nations. And it was born in 1945. It is only the second attempt in all of human history to have a universal body to address global scale issues. It's filled with problems. And one of the big problems is it was designed in a two-tiered way. 5 countries were given preeminence, that you can't do anything binding without their unanimous agreement. And that is the US, and it was originally the Soviet Union, China, which was originally the nationalist China, and Britain and France. So 5 powers, which we now call the P5, or the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, can veto anything that is binding and can block any change in the charter itself that is the Constitution of the UN. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, it's also a universal body, but it has a single chamber, a little bit like the Senate, in that each state in the US gets 2 votes, but in the UN, each country gets 1 vote. And that's true whether you're Nauru, which is the smallest population of the 193 with 12,000 people, or China, or now actually, I should say, up to date, India, which is now the most populous country, both China and India, 1.4 billion people. So they each get 1 vote. Now, this also has its problem, obviously, in terms of, is that the right mode of representation of people around the world? So I've been donating, I'd say, most of my time in the last 25 years to the UN. Yeah. I am fully aware of all of the difficulties, contradictions, and so on. But I love the idea that 8 billion people through 193 representative national governments talk to each other at least.
Yeah,
I love the idea of the UN Security Council. And I testified a couple of times in the UN Security Council in the last 2 years. And I love the idea that in a civilized way, no one shooting at each other in the room, except through their verbal statements, they're actually talking. Does it work great? No, obviously it does not work great. Could it be reformed? Absolutely. Again, we could have days of discussion of what to do. But what else are we going to do but to try to make it work and to understand that it's only the second attempt in the 300,000 years of our species to actually have global governance.
Yeah, and okay, well, that's, I suppose, puts it in perspective and explains why maybe new forms are required at some point. But you might say it's like democracy, the worst form of government except for all the rest. But
yeah, but it also needs to be fixed, and this is part of the job of the 21st century.
I'm itching to get to recent affairs, but I can't resist, maybe because of my training with Noam Chomsky early on. When you say, okay, Roosevelt, I mean, given the makeup, especially the P5, would you not say that the desire was not to have a world government, but to divvy up the world for U.S. and for major power control, and the UN was a sort of a legitimizing force to allow the U.S. to appear to have international goals when really it was trying to control its hegemony? I'm going to be the devil's advocate and say that.
No, I think at the time, Roosevelt, by the way, was really unusual in American leaders. He really was actually an anti-imperialist, and he really believed in economic rights, and he believed in human rights, and he was really an extraordinarily decent, unbelievably shrewd and effective and clever politician. So I really like him. From everything I've studied over the last 50 years, I like him. Okay. Complicated personality also, by the way, but I like him a lot. And I don't think that it was not to divvy up the world. He was no fan of the British Empire, which was the dominant empire up until the end of World War II. The United States became the dominant empire afterwards. But at a practical level, it was not actually to give control to the five. It was to give control to the one. Yeah. The United States was going to largely run the show.
Exactly.
But had it been Roosevelt, it actually would have run the show in a quite decent way. It would have decolonized the world. It would have made for good neighbors in Latin America. It would have done things that Roosevelt truly believed in. He submitted in 1944 to the U.S. Congress an economic Bill of Rights. His wife, after Roosevelt's death, Eleanor Roosevelt, presided over the promulgation and adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That was not a game. That was not a PR stunt. That was a very deeply moving, important step in our global evolution as humanity, to say that there are basic rights for all people as individuals around the world and their human dignity. Now, has the UN served all these high purposes? Not quite. But at the same time, the bodies that have been created by the UN, UNESCO for education, science, and culture, for ITU for international telecommunications, WHO for the World Health Organization, and many, many others, are actually led, people say by international bureaucrats, but they're led by people who really believe in the international mission. They're multicultural, multinational, and above any other institution I know, they take a global perspective, which is very hard because if you're in the US, you're almost bound, compelled to take a national perspective. Even if you're in a university, our universities are funded by the Defense Department. They're funded by the State Department. They're funded by government grants. My colleagues are often aghast at what I say because I don't take the US government line. Partly I'm not dependent on it, thank God. But, I find in the UN, the ethos really is different because people come from different countries. Now, the U.S. still, has its hand on things through its share of the budget and so forth. But truly, among all of our imperfect institutions, if you want to hear an international point of view, not just a national government point of view, the UN you're going to hear it much more in the UN than typically you'd even hear in an East Coast university of the United States.
Okay, absolutely. No doubt about that. The universities are not, okay, we won't get into that. But, and so this is a great segue because people might imagine, based on your comments about Roosevelt and the fact that you have been a quote unquote insider in many ways, that you hew the insider line. And we're going to spend the next few minutes and not anywhere near as much as I'd like, making it clear that you're not. We're going to talk about. I looked just at random at 9 pieces you've written, and we won't get through all 9, unfortunately. But they deal with Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, the CIA, U.S. foreign policy, in a way which, in almost every way, radically differs from the party line of what you'd hear in either mainstream media or in the U.S. government or in many other places. So let's talk about some things, and as I say, people should be prepared for arguments and discussions that are going to upset a lot of people, but it's important to have them, and I'm always impressed that you have the courage to state them. The first one is a framework, one you wrote in November 30th, early on. Relatively early on after October 7th, a framework for peace in Israel and Palestine, where you argued right off that the only way to end this was to welcome Palestine as a UN member state. This might shock some people that the first thing you do after what many people what many people claim is an unprovoked, or at least certainly an unacceptable and horrific act of terrorism, to recognize Palestine as a UN member state, with pre 1967 borders, and why don't you just spend a few minutes talking about that?
Yeah, I think that there are 2 overarching issues I would say about all of my views. One is that any event is not really an event, it's part of a dynamic process.
Okay.
So you can never say, well, things started on October 7, Hamas made an attack, or that Putin, unprovoked, attacked Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. So whenever you see in the media, which you see all the time, unprovoked, it's phony. As a physicist, you would say, the world is governed by dynamical processes. They could have some uncertainties in them in the wave equation, or in Newtonian mechanics, we thought we were able to predict everything about the future from knowing the current state. But in any event, there are dynamics, and that is true. So never look at a snapshot. Always look at the dynamics. The second thing is there are 2 versions of the world, if I could simplify a little bit. The United States policy truly is that the U.S. should run the show. This is actually formal doctrine. If you read formal, boring doctrine, like the security strategy or defense strategy of the United States, or in the academic world, the grand strategy in the international relations literature of the United States is to be the predominant power, or sometimes called the hegemon, or sometimes called the unipolar country. I really disagree with that philosophically because we are 4.1% of the world population. Who the hell gave 4.1% of the world population the right to run the other 95.9% of the world population? That's absurd. So these are the two predicates of almost everything I do, which is say, what are the dynamics here? So how do you help to move a more complex, multidimensional, dynamic system, if you want to put it that way? And second, don't take the U.S. line, take a global perspective, take a shared perspective. So when it comes to Israel and Palestine, there are two peoples, millions of each, on a common land. There is a long history of controversy about that, going back to the Balfour Declaration. There are heated ideological arguments on both sides. There are both sides saying the other doesn't belong here at all. And this is fraught with all of the heat, emotion, deep religious beliefs, and many other things that are part of this conflict. But it also has meant perpetual war and perpetual cycles of war. And it has also meant, in my experience, in my view, tremendous suffering of the Palestinian people relative to the suffering of the Israeli Jewish people, because Israel, quote, won, and it has had the United States at its back, and the Palestinian people have suffered tremendously in this. Since 1967, after the Six-Day War, Israel has occupied the West Bank and Gaza and part of the Golan Heights and so on. And I first went to Israel in 1972 in about the same, it was the same summer vacation after high school that I visited my East German pen pal. And I went to Israel for the first time, and I was told a phrase called facts on the ground. That we are going to put settlements into these occupied, conquered lands to make facts on the ground so that we'll always control those places. I was kind of innocent then. I didn't really understand the significance of it, but 52 years later, I came to understand much sooner than that this is going to be a recipe for profound unhappiness, injustice, and violence, and it has been. So I believe that those facts on the ground weren't quite so factual or clever as they said. There are now hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers in the West Bank.
700,000.
Yeah, and depending on where you draw lines and how you count, a couple 100,000 in East Jerusalem in some sense, or in the environment of East Jerusalem, and another 500,000 away from Jerusalem. And that has created a lot of zealotry as well, because a lot of these settlers have a religious, deeply
Messianic
embedded.
religious.
Yeah, exactly. And so they believe, well, God gave us this land and it's ours, and there's nothing more to say about it. So to my mind, we've got to end this cycle of violence before it ends up killing everybody, including everybody, in an escalating global war. And the way to do it is to divide the territory according to international law that has been promulgated for the last 57 years since the Six-Day War. And by international law, I mean votes of the UN Security Council principally, because that has said we need two states. It should be on the borders of the 4th of June, 1967. And it seems to me that this is what bargaining theory calls the focal point for the bargain. It's the only one that has a plausibility that can actually reach an outcome short of all-out war. And so there are people who say, well, we should have one state, or we should have a binational state, or we should have a democratic state. There are others who say there should be no Israel, wipe it off the map. There are those that say there should be no Palestine, wipe it off the map. I believe that the way to get this cycle of extreme violence and cruelty over is to implement international law. And I think it's going to happen, actually, that Palestine will become the 194th member of the United Nations. The U.S. is going to fight against this, but in the end, I don't think the U.S. can block this from happening. Israel, of course, is aghast at it.
Yeah.
But so what?
When you say Israel's aghast, I think it's important to point out the government of Israel is aghast.
Yeah, let me put it that way.
I'm not sure the public is.
No, you're right. I agree with you. I agree completely with you.
Now, I want to get to some key points which you make, which I think are interesting, that counter the general narrative. But one point I do want to say, people would counter you, say Israel isn't occupying Gaza because Israel removed itself in 2005 or so willingly, and it occupies the West Bank, but not Gaza. Would you at least agree with that or no?
No, not at all.
Good.
If you have a prison and the guards guard the inmates going in and out of their cells, but they don't live inside the cells, I would say they're still occupying the prison.
Okay.
And so that's what Gaza is.
Professor Sachs, how do the views of President Kennedy on nuclear test bans and respect for Russian culture compare to the actions of our current leaders, particularly regarding the three potential conflict areas you mentioned that risk a wider or even nuclear war?
Absolutely. We not only do not show respect for our counterparts, we show open hostility and, I would say, trash talking. I refer to three counterparts. First, to Russia. The narrative about Russia, that Putin is the new Hitler, that there's no talking to Putin, that war is the only way to protect Ukraine, is all warmongering propaganda of the military-industrial complex. It is false. It doesn't pass the test of any historical accuracy or scrutiny. What has happened is that the United States decided that it was the sole superpower and didn't have to listen to anybody else. And with regard to Russia, it violated every single interest of Russia repeatedly from the 1990s onward. I happen to know this at a personal level because I was an economic advisor to President Gorbachev and to President Yeltsin. They wanted peace and they wanted cooperation. But we said, no, we will run the world, thank you. We will overthrow your allies, whether in Serbia or in Syria or in Iraq or in Libya. We will unilaterally abandon treaties like the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty or the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, the INF Treaty that Trump left. We will expand NATO contrary to our commitment. We will overthrow regimes in your neighborhood, like we did with Yanukovych in February 2014. We will arm adversaries on your borders. And what are we doing at a human level? We are canceling performances by Russian artists. We are canceling concerts by Russian composers. We are banning the teaching of great Russian novels. It's unimaginable how wrong this approach is in every single way. Kennedy made peace through respect, even at the height of the Cold War. We don't have respect. We have trash talking by Biden, which is a shame of an American president. A shame. He should watch his mouth. because he does not behave like he should. Then we have disrespect for the Arab countries the same way. We lie in every way. We wring our hands as 37,000 people die, but we don't do anything to stop the mass killing at all in Gaza. And with regard to China, which has had a remarkable success in raising the living standards of the Chinese people, and incidentally hasn't been in one war for more than 40 years, as we've been in perpetual war, we do nothing but trash talk China. How it's a failure, how its economy will go down, how it's in crisis, how it's warmongering, how it's a danger, how it's a threat to the world. It's vulgar. I go to China several times a year and have done so for decades. And our propaganda is laughable if it were not so troubling. And Biden is part of this as well. So I do not have any admiration for how we're handling things. We're making everything far more dangerous than it should be and needs to be. We could negotiate peaceful relations in all three regions instantly. We could end the war in Ukraine in a day by declaring that NATO will never enlarge to Ukraine, that this was a bad idea, it was a broken promise, it was a danger to Russia. We have to find a different way to have security in the region, so-called collective security, not security at the expense of Russia for Ukraine. And this could lead to a diplomatic outcome. We can end the war in the Middle East by recognizing the state of Palestine, as the UN Security Council and UN General Assembly have called for. And we can end the conflict with China by simultaneously saying we're not going to arm Taiwan, we're not going to get into internal Chinese affairs, but we appeal to China's best interests and the world's best interests for peaceful relations across the Straits of Taiwan. And that will occur as long as the US isn't provoking a conflict by shipping massive armaments to Taiwan. So we have a foreign policy based on war and belligerency, and lo and behold, we continue to approach midnight on the doomsday clock.
Imran Khan is a personal acquaintance and friend of yours, right? Could you speak to that situation a little bit and why it's important for Americans to know about that?
Well, Imran Khan is an extremely fine individual and an excellent leader of Pakistan. And the U.S. helped to get him thrown from power. The story is a very unpleasant one. It was exposed by The Intercept. When Imran Khan did not immediately fall into the U.S. camp vis-a-vis Russia and China, the way that the American security state works is if you're not with us, you're against us. Imran Khan said, no, I'm not against anybody. I want good relations with the U.S., with China, with Russia. That doesn't work with the United States. You're with us or you're against us. And so the U.S. senior State Department official called in the Pakistani ambassador and said, you know, we don't like the way that Imran Khan, who was then prime minister, is talking. Maybe it's not good for our relations. Maybe something should be done about it. And this was part of a standard U.S. regime change ploy. The note by the Pakistani diplomat was sent back home, and Imran Khan was voted out of office in a vote of no confidence the following month. This is a standard U.S. intervention. Imran Khan said to me, and he said publicly, you know, the United States has gotten me thrown out of power. He was, of course, ridiculed by the U.S. and the Pakistani military for making that claim. Then he got a copy of the memo, the one that The Intercept ended up releasing. And when he waived it, he was charged with espionage. So on the one hand, it didn't exist. On the other hand, charged with espionage. And he was landed in prison before the elections, which were recently held. His party was outlawed as a party. Despite that, the backers of Imran Khan won an overwhelming landslide victory in the election. And then the votes were falsely counted. So they couldn't deny all the votes, but they denied enough of the votes to take away the majority. In other words, even despite imprisonment, even despite these charges, even despite the U.S. ploy, Imran Khan prevailed in the elections. And of course, the ballots were falsely counted, and he was deprived of power. And the U.S. State Department shrugged its shoulders, as it does, because the U.S. State Department does not tell the truth to the world. It does not tell the truth to the American people. The American people would not know anything about this but for the brave word of The Intercept. So this is part of what people should understand more generally is American foreign policy. American foreign policy is depose governments that the U.S. does not like. Don't deal with them, don't negotiate them, try to overthrow them. This can be done by open war, or it can be done covertly. But this is the way that America operates in foreign policy. It is a disaster. It is a disaster for the United States, which has spent trillions of dollars in useless wars on false premises. It is a disaster for the targeted countries, which often are dragged into even decades of instability, such as Afghanistan, where the collapse of Afghanistan came after the CIA was charged with overthrowing an Afghan government in 1979. And this is a story that has happened all over the world. We need a new foreign policy, one that is cooperative, one that is honest, one that protects America through peace and cooperation, not through meddling and regime change operations and wars of choice abroad.
In fact, it's explicitly the same idea. If you read the things that the U.S. government actually writes about security, defense, so-called, and foreign policy strategy, the key idea is what they call primacy. That the U.S. should be the most powerful country in every region of the world. Not only the most powerful of a world power, but the most powerful in every region. It needs to dominate. So in Europe, it needs to dominate Russia. That's what we've been talking about. In Asia, it needs to dominate China. Well, good luck on that. China's 1.4 billion people, a very sophisticated society. And strangely enough, China does not want to be dominated by the United States. China has enough memory of what foreign domination has meant. The British behaved abysmally in China, and the Chinese see the Americans, rightly so, as part of that Anglo-Saxon mentality. Remember, the British invaded China in 1839 to force China to accept opium. It's amazing. It's like as if the Colombian cocaine cartel invaded the United States to say you have to open your markets to Colombian cocaine.
That was a brilliant comparison. Brilliant comparison.
Oh, but this is exactly what Britain did, and China. They don't forget that. And now, what this has practically meant is that starting around 20 years ago, but really 10 years ago intensively, the United States strategists, if you could call them that, said China's rise is a threat to the United States because China's a big country. And so we have to take measures to stop China's rise. This is a kind of insanity, actually, because it's exactly what leads to wars. It's not the business of the United States to try to stop China's rise, but that's precisely what they are doing through unilateral tariff measures, blocking China's exports to the U.S., blocking American investments in China, taking measures like this stupid one last month where the U.S. Congress voted that TikTok has to either close or sell its operations to an American company. The U.S. went after Huawei, which is an excellent company, very innovative, very dynamic, and that's precisely why the U.S. attacked it, because it was too successful. The U.S. has stopped the sale of advanced semiconductors to China. The U.S. thinks this is normal, but the most dangerous point is the U.S. is doing in Taiwan what it did in Ukraine. You know, for Ukraine, this is core Russian security. For the United States to say we're going to move our military into Ukraine is a direct and immediate threat to Russian security, a point that Putin has made for basically 20 years. In the case of China, Taiwan is the same security threat for China, especially after the period from 1839 to 1949, where imperial powers continued to invade China, threaten Chinese unity, carve off pieces of China as part of Japan's empire, and so on. China says, don't meddle in our unity. And that's why when countries establish diplomatic relations with China, they must adopt the one China policy, which says you are not going to try to separate pieces of China and divide our country again, as you did for a century, from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. Taiwan looms very large in that story because Taiwan, actually both Taiwan and mainland China, the People's Republic of China, both have in their founding documents, the Republic of China in Taipei says there's one China. They disagree who should run it, but it's one China. But when the United States established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, it adopted the one China policy, that Taiwan is part of China. And yet it plays games, worse than games, extremely dangerous measures, saying, well, we're going to have a trade agreement with Taiwan. We're going to have arms agreements with Taiwan. We're going to support Taiwan's security, all while Taiwan is supposed to be part of China. And the United States ignores mainland China on this, ignores the People's Republic of China. Well, this is absolutely heading towards a war if the U.S. continues this. And I can't emphasize enough how stupid our Congress members are. They're people that are completely irresponsible. They don't know any history. They come from someplace in America, thousands of miles away from China. They've never been to China, but boy, they know everything about China. And they know that they're going to send weapons to Taiwan and they're going to protect Taiwan. And what they are doing is leading us closer and closer to war. And in the United States, in our press, this idea of a war with China is being normalized. It's mentioned almost every day in some news story. Oh, maybe there'll be a war with China, as if this isn't one of the greatest insanities one could imagine, because this would be potentially the end of the world. Yet the American mainstream media normalizes a war with Russia or normalizes a war with China as if this is absolutely normal and necessary, because after all, the United States needs to be number one in the world, and it's going to do what it needs to do to be number one. And in the meantime, this is what's leading to chaos in so many places.
Exactly. It's horrible. I would say that there was nothing similar so far in the, let's say, in the history. You remember the Caribbean crisis. The leaders of both Washington and Moscow, at a certain moment, they understood that this is the red line. They should not cross at any, let's say, situation or circumstances. They were clever enough to stop from both sides, and this lecture, this lesson, was taken as something of a key importance for next many decades. Now, as if this is a taboo. It's unbelievable. I mean,
yeah, although I would say the following. You know, I've studied the Cuban Missile Crisis for a long time, tried to understand it. The truth is, we were extraordinarily lucky to get out of that alive. And it is, in the U.S. case, most of John F. Kennedy's top advisors wanted to go to war. They wanted to have a military approach. It was almost only Kennedy and a couple of others, Adlai Stevenson and a couple of others, said, no, we need a diplomatic way out. On the Soviet side, there was actually more prudence. I don't think Gromyko wanted a war, and Nikita Khrushchev certainly didn't want a war. And in fact, when he put the missiles into Cuba in 1962, Gromyko said, "What is this? Are we going to war?" And Khrushchev said, "No, we're not going to war, but we're just going to teach the Americans a little bit of their own medicine because they have missiles in Turkey. We're going to show them what it's like." But it was a big miscalculation because it almost led to the end of the world. But Khrushchev and Kennedy had the sense to pull back. But I'm not sure that our politicians today have that sense. Honest to God, I have to tell you, there are so many stupid and irresponsible American politicians. You can't even believe it. They don't care about war. They talk about war as normal. They want to send so many Ukrainians to their deaths because they even say the Ukraine war is wonderful. No Americans are dying, as if 500,000 Ukrainians aren't enough dead, and as if the risk of nuclear war isn't great enough. So I'm very worried. In the United States system, so much power resides in the president. We've had a string of very mediocre to poor to dangerous presidents over the last 20 years. None of them has risen to the occasion. None. This is really very worrisome because our political system is broken. It's corrupted. It's not bringing the best people to the forefront by any means. Our two lead candidates right now, I regard Biden's presidency as a failure because he doesn't understand diplomacy. He's also 81 and he's too old for this job. And Trump is a very unstable person. These are our two lead candidates. This is something terrible for the world. And in the meantime, so many European leaders, I think, including in the Czech Republic, say, oh, yes, we follow the United States. That's our greatest ally. We have to do whatever the United States does. And don't people realize, don't do that. Be careful. You know, Europe needs its own strategy, and it needs a strategy of peace, not a strategy of war.
Exactly. Tell me, as an American, after all these critical formulations, where is the break-even point, or how to call it, which would bring your political class, your political elite, to an understanding that the policies based on the obsessive primacies, let's say, targets and so on, are not realistic, and that a win-win strategy is the only, let's say, realistic option, which will be very good also for the United States. When and where this moment would come.
It's very important to know this and very hard to answer this. I can't imagine Biden or Trump leading that, and yet these are the two leading candidates right now. Uh, Neither of them has an understanding or realistic vision of the world. Neither of them has the idea that the world should be unified and in peace so that it can address problems together. None of them has the idea that the US and China should cooperate with each other because it's the two most powerful countries, and the worst thing in the world would be a war. Even a Cold War, but a hot war between them is unimaginable. And so how this is going to happen and when is really a major puzzle. And what I believe is the case is that only the U.S., to get out of this peacefully, has to listen to public opinion. I work at the UN every day. At the UN, it's clear that the vast majority of countries in the world want peace and cooperation, and they don't want to choose sides between the US and China or between the US and Russia. They don't want to choose sides. They don't want to impose sanctions on Russia. They don't want to go to war against Russia because the US tells them to do so. So I'm trying to explain to American public opinion and to American politicians that they're running against the whole spirit of the whole world. The U.S. is becoming increasingly isolated. One of the problems is, though, so much of Europe follows the U.S. blindly right now. And this is a puzzle for me because Europe's smarter than the U.S. It has more bad experience also in war. It should understand that this is a dead end. And Europe should understand, of course, that American hegemony or American primacy is not Europe's advantage. Europe is going to benefit from a multipolar world in which Europe is one of the poles of power, creativity, insight, and diplomacy, not as a vassal state of NATO. And yet the European leaders are very bad at this right now. You look at van der Leyen, she's, in my view, nothing but a U.S. Bureaucrat, basically.
Yes,
I find it very, very sad. And European foreign policy is basically do what the U.S. says. And if the U.S. blows up the Nord Stream pipeline, endangering the European economy, everybody pretends it didn't happen. Or pretends that it was Russia that blew up its own pipeline or some other crazy idea like that.
Yeah. One more specific question, if you allow me. You have in the States the act called FARA or FARA, with Foreign Agents Regulation Act or something like this. There is a similar law in Russia, in Israel, and so on. And frankly speaking, in the countries like the Czech Republic, there's a growing interest in that maybe we should have something similar, because these as if NGOs, which are led by people from George Soros and so on, they are, let's say, playing their own games beyond any legal, let's say, democratic procedures and so on. And in other countries like, say, Georgia now, there's a big dispute whether the country can have a law which would, let's say, regulate somehow the activities of similar entities. What is your opinion upon this?
My opinion is very clear, which is the United States should stop meddling in the politics of other countries. Because what this is about is not simply NGOs. This is about politics. This is about U.S. money, official and quasi-private, because even these NGOs are aligned with the U.S. government. But this is about U.S. money turning the politics of other countries, even stoking unrest like the Maidan in Ukraine was a U.S.-funded operation. How do I know? Because they told me, because I saw it with my own eyes. U.S. Improper involvement in what was a coup. I saw it, and I hated it. And I have to say that this is what's happening in Georgia, too. The U.S. says, oh, this is an infringement of Georgian rights. The infringement of Georgian rights is that the U.S. is meddling in Georgian politics. The U.S. should keep out of Georgian politics, and with all respect, Georgians should keep out of American politics.
Exactly.
So this is the basic point. And these laws are put in place to try to stop the meddling. We had senators go to the Maidan and chant to the people there, "We're with you, we're on your side," and so forth. Imagine if Chinese politicians had come to Donald Trump's rally on January 6th, 2021. Do you think the American people would say, "Oh, that's fine, isn't that nice? Other countries are getting involved in our riots or our demonstrations or our protests or whatever"? No, the United States would not like it at all. It would drive our politics crazy. And indeed, even the false charges of Russian involvement in U.S. politics drove American politics crazy. But it's very important to understand, when you are an empire like the United States, double standards is the basic principle. The basic principle. You don't have to be consistent. You do what you tell others not to do. And the U.S. meddles everywhere in the world through the National Endowment of Democracy, the National Democratic Institute, USAID, NGOs. I know it. I've seen it with my own eyes. It's not good. It's not healthy. This is what's going on right now.
Last question. I'm too much consuming of your time. There is a category of enemy images. We understand, most of us, what does it mean. And this is an even ever bigger instrument in the dirty games, which are pushing the world to very critical, if not dangerous, let's say, situations. What can we, Jeff, do, let's say, against these enemy images? And could we somehow cooperate across the Atlantic in these efforts?
We need to cooperate globally, because we need to bring in Chinese colleagues, Russian colleagues, African colleagues, Latin American colleagues. We hear so much falsity. I almost never hear the truth from the U.S. government anymore. I know the situation with my own eyes all over the world, because that's my work. My work is to be abroad. My work is to be engaged in discussions with governments all over the world. That's what it means to work with the United Nations and on international objectives. And so I hear directly many things, and I can see with my own eyes and hear with my own ears that the U.S. is lying so much of the time. Now, the mainstream media generally repeats these lies. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the main cable networks. This is a big problem, because the public hears a false view of things. And in Europe, it's been the same. Ever since the Ukraine war broke out, if you say anything that says, well, there's a background to it, there's a history to it, there should have been peace, this has to do with NATO, immediately you're branded, you're a Putin apologist, you're a fool, you get on Ukraine's hate list, many things, all to shut down debate. Same thing is happening with respect to Israel right now. Israel is committing terrible war crimes, I believe genocide. But if you say so, oh no, you're violating every standard, every norm. So truth is really at a premium right now, and that's why what you're doing and alternative outlets are so important because. And it's probably the big benefit of the digital age in this regard. There are many downsides, but at least we have the chance to hear a wider range. You have to search for it. It's not going to come in the mainstream media. And interestingly, we had Tucker Carlson in the United States interview President Putin, and he was attacked by all the mainstream. How dare you do that? And yet hundreds of millions of people watch that apparently. And that is amazing because people want to hear themselves. They don't want to hear it through these government propaganda outlets, basically. So this is what we really need to do. It's hard. And the dangers are very high right now because we're really in the midst of a very, very serious crisis, which, as I've explained, I believe the United States has done the most to instigate, actually. And we need diplomacy just to stay alive. And if we can stay alive and stop the worst, then we can work on getting the truth out, too. I don't know whether it will become law, but it is another sign of the ridiculousness of American politics, I'm afraid. There is a kind of anti-China hysteria. This is part of American politics. There's also a sub-theme that TikTok must be controlled so that terrible messaging on TikTok is not permitted. So there's a lot of fear and paranoia and anti-China sentiment wrapped up in this. We don't know these days what will actually become law, what is merely for public consumption before elections this November. So I can't give you a prediction, but I can tell you that it is absurd.
We've seen some opponents to the TikTok divestment bill. They're claiming that if the bill is passed, it will violate the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Do you think that sort of argument has its basis? Do you agree?
Well, this is definitely an attempt to control the media, and it's based on a lot of fear and misrepresentation. There are things lurking in the legislation that could give government more and more control that would be undesirable. So I'm hoping that the whole thing dies and that is kind of a publicity stunt, but not a real initiative. We shall see.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because while the government is suppressing TikTok, we have seen U.S. President Joe Biden's re-election campaign. They actually launched an official TikTok account last month. And White House responded by claiming that the Biden administration's policy on TikTok hasn't changed. How do we understand this sort of seemingly inconsistent behavior?
Well, I wouldn't say that consistency is a hallmark of politics or a hallmark of U.S. politics. So none of this is surprising. There's a lot of hypocrisy. There's a lot of fear-mongering. There's a lot of grandstanding. None of it stands up to rational scrutiny.
Donald Trump, meanwhile, said he opposed the bill.
Well, that will certainly have its effect on Republican members of Congress. Trump is the clear leader of the Republican Party. He is their nominee. He has a very good chance of being reelected president. And so what he says matters in this.
But it could all just be election rhetoric that could be gone within months.
I think it's a little bit more than that because the anti-China sentiments transcend mere election politics. They are stoked more during the election period, but we're in a not very thoughtful phase of American politics that now is more than 10 years old, in which the American political class views China as a threat and a danger, and acts, in my view, in irrational ways that make the situation worse.
Now, how do you think this year's election is going to impact Sino-US relations?
Well, first I'll tell you, as I'm sure you know, the overwhelming sentiment in the United States is, my God, this is our two choices. People are not happy with this at all. They want a different option because they're not happy with having to see this rerun between Biden, who's now 81 years old, Trump, 77, I believe. None of them spring chickens. It's actually time for new leadership and a new generation, aside from the fact that each of these two candidates has very high disapproval ratings with the public compared to the approval ratings. So this is not a case of two popular politicians going after each other. This is a case where the American people are asking what is happening to our political system that delivers candidates we do not want. And this remains to be seen how this will be played out this year.
In the State of the Union address, President Biden emphasized the U.S.'s support for Ukraine. I know you said in a recent article that Biden and Schumer want to throw more Ukrainians' lives and more tens of billions of dollars at this glaring failure. You've also mentioned that Ukraine's security can only be achieved at the negotiating table and not by some fantasizing military triumph over Russia. Would you please elaborate for us? Why do you make such a conclusion?
When the Soviet Union was dissolved in December 1991, the American deep state took that as the moment of unipolarity, that now the United States can do what it wants, where it wants. And it decided on a strategy of expanding the U.S. military alliance as far and wide as possible. In the European context, that meant the expansion of NATO. As the Soviet Union disbanded its military alliance, which had been called the Warsaw Pact, NATO expanded into the former Warsaw Pact countries. Similarly, in East Asia, we know that the United States built new alliances and aimed to strengthen its military presence in the South China Sea region, throughout the rim of countries surrounding China. This was part of the same idea that America is the unipolar power. It should not be face competition by Russia, by China, or by any other part of the world. It was a policy of arrogance. It was bound to result in confrontation with Russia and, of course, with rising tensions with China, because if you keep pushing your alliance up to the borders of the other country, naturally you're going to create threats. By the time the NATO enlargement reached Ukraine, which is a 2,000-kilometer border with Russia, and two countries that have a very intertwined history for hundreds of years, the Russian political class said, no, stop, no farther. We don't want you, NATO, we don't want you, the United States, on our border. But the United States' attitude was, who cares what Russia thinks? We are the superpower. Russia is some second-rate regional power. That was the American attitude, even explicitly stated that way by President Obama at one point. So the United States continued to push. It helped to engineer a coup in Ukraine in February 2014 that overthrew a president that wanted neutrality for Ukraine to install a government that wanted NATO for Ukraine. And the war broke out at that point 10 years ago. It's been going on since then. I have repeatedly said the United States should acknowledge expanding NATO to Ukraine was a dangerous and unjustified idea, and one that was viewed by Russia as an existential threat, and therefore one that Russia would not allow. So I've said to the American leadership and public repeatedly, acknowledge that NATO will not expand to Ukraine, and then we can have peace in Ukraine. But the United States political class has not been willing to accept that kind of self-constraint. So until today, even now, hundreds of thousands of people dead, the United States continues to push for NATO enlargement. And just recently, the Secretary General of NATO, Mr. Jens Stoltenberg, said Ukraine will join NATO. To my point of view, this means ongoing war. It means ongoing destruction of Ukraine. It's something that can never be achieved because Russia will fight absolutely to prevent it. And if there were rational and sane people that were thinking about the real interest of Ukraine and the interest of the world, on the Western side, they would say, you know, this whole thing has been a bad idea. We stopped the NATO enlargement. We opened direct talks with Russia. We find a way to make peace in Ukraine. This is possible until today.
Who is benefiting in the US from continuing the war in Ukraine?
Broadly speaking, of course, nobody benefits from war if we think about the overall common good. The world has suffered.
Of course.
Ukraine has suffered the most. Europe has suffered very badly. It's in open recession now because Europe lost its normal economic trade with Russia. In the United States, the public is very unhappy. Most of the public wants all of this to end. Biden is not winning any public support for the position on Ukraine. So broadly speaking, nobody wins from an ongoing war like this. But of course, there are pockets of profiteering in war. The military-industrial complex, our major companies like Northrop Grumman or Boeing are, of course, seeing increased arms contracts, and they defend this. There are a lot of institutions, especially in the East Coast of the United States where I live, even at the universities and the Washington think tanks, that are basically funded by the military-industrial complex. So they come out for the war. The politicians say to themselves, you know, I have arms manufacturers in my district. That's jobs in my district. I also get campaign contributions, they say to themselves, from the military-industrial companies. So they side with this. It's a bit of a game. I've called it a scam, a corruption of American foreign policy by these private interests. So the question, who gains? Basically, the world loses, but a small group does profiteer from the war and from the warmongering.
What do you think of the US's military spending? For example, in the year 2024, I believe there is a 886, I think the number is billion US dollars of military spending planned. What do you think of that figure?
Well, first of all, the figure is an underestimate because that counts only what's in the Pentagon budget. There is nuclear weapons spending in the Department of Energy. There is the so-called Homeland Security budget. There is the CIA and intelligence agencies budget. And then there's a big ticket, very sad one, called the Veterans Administration, which pays for all the disabled American veterans who have lost limbs or suffered other disasters, often lifelong, from war. That's hundreds of billions of dollars in addition. So we're well over $1 trillion a year. And this spending has gone to the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Ukraine, also the roughly 800 U.S. military bases around the world. It's a colossal waste of money. It leads to war, it leads to suffering, it leads to instability, and it has been a major factor in the accumulation of public debt in the United States. None of this is popular with the American people, so the politicians don't go to the public and say, this is so important, you have to pay taxes. No. What they do is they say, it doesn't cost you anything. We'll borrow to finance this $1 trillion. So we have a huge budget deficit, a rising debt, an unpopular policy, and this is our current situation. Of course, it stokes an arms race with China. It stokes an arms race with other countries, because if we had normal relations with China, if we had normal relations with Russia, we would all say, better that we keep our military spending low and that we don't antagonize each other. We don't threaten each other. We don't need to waste all of this money on armaments because we're not a threat to each other. That's the kind of world we should be aiming for.
In the meantime, we have a lot of foreign media, Western media, that say China is spending too much on its military budget. China's figure being about 1/4 of what is reported, as I just quoted, of what US is spending.
Yes, China has increased its military budget, but it is a fraction of the US. And if both sides would actually, if we would talk with each other, if the United States had not launched another very bad idea called AUKUS, which is a new military alliance of the US, UK, and Australia, for example. Oh, what a waste of money, waste of time, threat to China, useless for all of us, useless. If we had not gone that way, we wouldn't need all of this increase of military spending. So I really put the onus on the United States, which has been spending more than the next 10 countries combined on military spending, to stop wasting our own money in the United States and to say to the rest of the world, we can move back to a situation of arms control and normal diplomatic relations rather than confrontation. This is, of course, what we need.
The dollar's share of global reserves is expected to continue its trend of slipping as emerging market and developing economies are seeking further diversification in the currency composition of their reserves. What is going on? What's wrong with the dollar? Will it become stronger or weaker going forward?
Over time, the share of international transactions in the dollar will surely diminish. And that could happen faster than people expect. Right now, rough estimates say that about 60% of all international trade and financial settlements occur in dollars. And by occurring in dollars, it means occurring in the international banking system that deals in dollars, mainly in Europe and in the so-called SWIFT settlements. The problem is twofold, actually threefold. One is that the relative share of the US in the world economy is falling gradually, but it's declining, and it's going to continue to decline. So why should so much of the world's transactions be in dollars? The second is that there are new technologies for making settlements, such as digital central bank currencies, which China, the People's Bank of China, has been experimenting with in recent years, and I think will continue to develop. This means you don't have to go through the banking system in the same way for settlements, and certainly not the US banking system. But the third problem is that the United States came to view this important role of the dollar as a weapon of foreign policy. Look at the freeze of Russian financial assets, $300 billion frozen of Russian assets because the United States said so, basically. Russia is not alone. This has happened to Afghanistan, to Iran, to Venezuela, to North Korea, to others. The United States decides unilaterally that your assets are our assets now, that you can't use the dollar trading system. And of course, countries are waking up to this vulnerability. Who wants to have their reserves confiscated? Who wants to be blocked from international trade because there isn't an alternative mechanism? So the aim of the BRICS this year is, in fact, to develop non-dollar payments mechanisms.
Right.
My experience and view is this is not so hard. So I think that there will be ways to settle in renminbi. There will be ways to settle in rupees. There will be ways to settle in rubles. There will be perhaps a new unit of account established to facilitate non-dollar settlements. I think the BRICS will come up with some interesting ideas this year, and that will accelerate the shift out of dollars.
And Professor Sachs, you predicted that the hegemony of the US dollar will end within, I think you said, 10 years. How does this time frame of a decade come about? What makes you decide it's 10 years?
Of course, it's a guess, so let me be clear about that, because nobody can predict the future with accuracy at a time like this. But my view is that the idea that the dollar must be used is a great exaggeration. There are many economists, my counterparts, who say, well, there is no alternative. This I do not believe. My own experience is that the currency is not the fundamental part of an economy. It's the mechanism for settling transactions. And it can happen in many different currencies. You can invent the euro. You can internationalize the renminbi. You can create even new currencies. I've been involved in that in 2 countries, helping governments to introduce new national currencies. So my view is that it's easier than it looks to make the workaround from the dollar. Of course, if the U.S. foreign policy changed and became far more cooperative and trustworthy, maybe the U.S. dollar would sustain a longer reign as the dominant currency. But if the relations between the U.S., China, Russia, and others remain very fraught, there will be substitutes. That's my main point. And they will be easier to come up with than is currently believed, and it will happen faster than is currently believed. And my example, I would say, of justifying that view is that the U.S. believed that the sanctions against Russia would kill the Russian economy. Of course, it did nothing of the sort. It was based on an exaggerated view of the centrality of the dollar. It was based on an exaggerated view of what the cost would be of cutting Russia out of the SWIFT banking system. But the U.S. did it. Russia more than survived this. It shows that alternatives can be created even from 1 month to the next, basically. It doesn't even take 10 years in that regard.